true, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven and in earth, and I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, observe how healthily, how calmly I could tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object? There was none. Passion? There was none. I loved the old man. He had never given me insult. He had never done me wrong. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. And whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch to his chamber, oh, so gently. And when I had made a space sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, closed, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. You would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head so far within the room that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Now, would a madman have been so wise as this? And when my head was well within the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And in the morning, when the sun broke, I went boldly into his chamber, and I spoke courageously to him, calling him by name and inquiring how he had passed the night. He would have been a profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at midnight, I gazed upon him while he slept. And upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. And never before that night had I felt the extent of my powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening his door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now, you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch from the thick darkness, for the shutters were all close-fastened for fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening in the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and I was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped on the tin fastening. The old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept very still. I said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle. And in the meantime, I did not hear him lie back down. No, he was still sitting up in bed listening, just as I had done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not the groan of pain nor of grief. Oh, no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echoes the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him, although I chuckled at heart, because I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he moved on the bed, and his fears had ever since been growing upon him, and he had been trying to fancy them causeless, but he could not. No, he had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney," or "It is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket that has made a single chirp." Yes. He'd been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. And when I had waited very patiently, a long time, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very tiny crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple, dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out the lantern and fell upon the vulture eye, and it was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I could see it with perfect distinctness, all a pale blue with this hideous veil over it. It chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses? Now I say there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well too. It was the beating of the old man's heart, and it increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained, and I kept still. I scarcely breathed. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the vulture eye, and meanwhile the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I said, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. But now, in the dead hour of night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet still I refrained, and I kept still. But the beating grew louder and louder. I felt the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety had seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I opened the lantern and I leaped into the room, and he shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and I pulled the heavy bed over him. And then I smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. And for many minutes more, the beating, it kept on with this muffled sound. But this, however, did not vex me, for it would not be heard through the wall. And at length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and I examined the corpse. He was stone dead. I placed my hand over the heart and I held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. And if you still think me mad, You will think so no longer when I describe to you the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. And I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly. No human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out. No stain of any kind. No blood spot whatever. I'd been too wary for that. A tub. Caught all. And when I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. And as the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the front door, and I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor in the night, and suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all through the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber, and I showed them his treasures, all secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat precisely upon the spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But before long, I felt myself getting pale, and I wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. Still they sat and still chatted. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and became more distinct, and it became more distinct, and it gained definiteness until at length I found that the ringing was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale. I talked more fluently and in a heightened voice, but the sound steadily increased. What could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard not. I, I, I talked more quickly and more vehemently, and yet the sound steadily increased. I arose and I argued about trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, and yet the sound steadily increased. And why would they not be gone? I, 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 I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, and yet the sound steadily increased. Oh, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I was sitting, and I grated it upon the boards, and yet the sound arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder and louder, and yet the officers still sat and chatted and smiled pleasantly. Was it possible that they heard not? No. No. They heard. They suspected. They knew. This I thought. And this I think. They were making a mockery of my horror. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I felt I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt I must scream or die. And now again, hark. Louder. 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 Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Here. Tear up the planks. Here. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart.